How much knowledge could we gain in rail preservation if someone were to undertake academic research into the field? Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to be talking to somebody who earned his doctorate in heritage railways. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to The Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 117 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're talking to Dr. Robin Coombes. Last time we had him on the show, he was just Robin Coombes, but now he has earned a PhD in heritage railways. He's done a thesis on heritage railways in the United Kingdom. And we're going to be learning from him what his research experience was, what takeaway points he has to share with us, and how to prepare for the future. Before we get into today's episode, there's a few things I'm excited to share with you. First up, I have launched a new video series called What Makes This Layout Great. It's a look at model railroading track plans, analyzing them using train simulators, and understanding what makes them fun to play with and what you might want to incorporate in your own designs. You can find the first episode by going to YouTube and searching What Makes This Layout Great. I'm developing a website to host future episodes of that. Second, we have new Patreon tiers and perks as a result of the development of this new series. Patreon.com/theroundhouse. You can see what those are. We've got hangouts, early access to episodes, both of this and that series, along with free photo prints. Patreon.com/theroundhouse. Thank you to all of you who are supporting the Roundhouse on Patreon, including our newest patron, Dan Worthy. He is a fireman, both in real life and now as part of the Roundhouse crew. Thank you for your support, Dan. Last thing I want to share with you is that we are running our launch sale of the Streamliner Media print store. Lots of photo prints available for purchase at streamlinermedia.com/store. And if you use the coupon code OURHOUSE, all lowercase, you get 5% off your first purchase. With all of that said, let's talk to our featured guest. Our guest today is the first PhD recipient in heritage railways from the Birmingham Center for Railway Research and Education, part of the University of Birmingham. Please welcome back to the Roundhouse, Dr. Robin Coombes.
Thank you. Hello, Nick.
It's wonderful to have you back. It feels really cool to be introducing you as Dr. Coombes. And it's so cool that you've been able to do this bit of research, which is not just a bit, it's a lot, as we will get into, on something that is so near and dear to your heart. What was the impetus for you to embark on this research?
I've always been driven by curiosity, and I had a project in 2015 where I was asked to look at a railway charity, a heritage railway charity, which I thought would be fairly simple. And remembering at that time, I had 30 years experience of governance. I've been chairman of a fairly large architectural practice. I've advised on governance. And suddenly I was entering a completely new world, something I thought was going to be fairly simple, but found that there was a war going on between the members and the board. And I was sort of parachuted into the middle to sort it out. And it was really the realization of just how complex heritage railways are, their charities, their support groups, how strong the emotions could be. And I really mean they were seriously strong. And like all projects, you start off and you try and do a little bit of research to find out what's been written. And you find out there's absolutely nothing written about the governance of heritage railways. And it was a realization that I actually knew not as much as I thought I knew. And therefore, I really could do a PhD. So that was the sort of actual impetus. But I mean, I've grown up with heritage railways. The first one was opened just 4 years before I was born. So I've seen their development over a very long period of time. And it's really always that curiosity of what is the next chapter? Will my children's children be able to experience living, breathing steam locomotives in their natural environment? Or are they just going to have them see them stuffed and mounted in a museum? Because, I mean, there's no doubt, I mean, heritage railways have faced unbelievable challenges throughout their existence, and they've overcome obstacles, created an amazing legacy. But there's no doubt at the moment there are a number of challenges on the horizon. I mean, whether it's, we pollute for pleasure, and that doesn't go down terribly well at the moment. We have an aging membership. We don't have a particularly diverse following. There are all sorts of challenges. Money is always an issue. We have a new generation that does not remember steam. Does it mean anything for them? How do we engage with that next generation? So there are a whole series of challenges, and each of those challenges can be overcome. I mean, there are answers. Yes, we can recruit and engage a completely new generation. We can tackle our environmental issues. We can do all those things, but they won't happen by accident. We really have to work very, very hard. And starting off on the real positive note, I mean, there is no technical, environmental, social, political reason why heritage railways will not continue indefinitely. The technology will certainly, we can keep renewing it. People will be around, but it won't happen by accident. And we really have to work very hard at all of those things. So it's really within our control, whether we keep this legacy going for future generations, because we're now a generation, we didn't really start it off, but we're now the stewards of an amazing legacy. Do we want to continue it, or is it going to fall apart on our watch?
An amazing legacy backed by incredible people power that oversees billions of pounds of assets in the United Kingdom. When you decided to go ahead with this research, what were your initial hypotheses going in? Because the centerpiece of your studies is this thesis. And what were these ideas that you wanted to test specifically at the core of it?
I had a very simple theory at the beginning, and I mean, based on 30 years of governance, 30 years of being a consultant, looking at organizations. It was simply that governance was the be all and end all of everything. And if you improve your governance, because everything starts with governance, that's all you had to do. That was my straightforward theory. And to my surprise, that did not prove the case. I mean, there is no question, and I would emphasize over and over again the importance of governance and leadership. It really is, the critical factor. However, once I started the research, I mean, the obvious thing you do is to look for failures, so that if you find failures, you look for the causes of those failures. And, what you would expect is that if your theory is to be proved, the railways that fell apart and failed, it was all down to poor governance. That with heritage railways is not the case, much to my surprise, when you actually looked at the evidence. And that's what the PhD was all about, because you really have to drill down into the evidence. And what you realize is that even railways with some seriously poor governance had not disappeared. So that meant that they were saved for some reason by other factors than their governance. And the way I sort of tackled that was to look at the sort of near death experiences, if you like, what had happened when a railway had really started to fall apart, and whether it was a sort of physical event like a landslip or whether they got into trouble with money. Each time they had, by a miracle, had saved themselves. And what had saved them? It's something which is called social capital. To you and me, it's simply the bank of goodwill. And it means that the membership simply won't let it fail, and whatever it takes, and whether they have to dig really deep into their pockets or rally round, they're capable of saving it. I mean, we've had in the UK the recent case of Llangollen Railway, and no doubt poor governance, and they became insolvent, bankrupt. That's it. So you think, well, that's the end. Some of their assets were sold off, but that railway today is still running. And why? Because fortunately they'd managed to ring fence the charity it runs alongside it, had ring fenced some of the assets, and they're carrying on. So even to that extent, railways are capable of surviving. So the overarching sort of conclusion is that social capital, and what do we mean by that in very practical terms? It means the motivation of all the volunteers. I mean, you have to remember that even the directors are volunteers. It's how much effort they put into it. It's how deep they dig into their pockets, and you can monetize that and value it. And that was part of really the discovery of the thesis, that the theory I set out to prove, I didn't. Which, that's why you do a PhD. You see if you can prove a theory.
I'm sure a lot of you listening are at least somewhat familiar with the scientific method. And the idea with a hypothesis is it's something that can be proven wrong. And so the fact that yours is something that could be proven wrong and led to another lane of research demonstrates that. Speaking of that research, how did you go about collecting information from the various heritage railways, and what information was most valuable to you? Having read the thesis, I see there's questionnaire elements, there's official formal interviews, there's sort of unofficial conversations. So what all is going into that process to gather that quote unquote data that you're able to apply academically?
Well, the first real challenge is that because I've been around and been involved with heritage railways for 30, 40 years, you have to completely set that aside. So everything you personally know goes onto the shelf to be rescued at another time. As a doing PhD, you are an independent researcher. You're there to observe, to run experiments, to do all those things. So your opinions, your views don't count at all. So that's the first challenge. Where you start off is what's typical for any sort of thesis or anything like that, is the literature review. And really that was the absolute joy, because there's very few academic work, or almost none, on heritage railways. There's a lot of books written about railways, which is just another chance to have a look at. I mean, I read every copy of the magazine in the UK called Steam Railway, but it was really to widen the reading into all the other related areas of economic theory, of social theory, of governance, of risk, and everything else, and really to try and get that sort of wider view. So, there's the reading element of it. Then there is the observation. So I set out to go to a heritage railways if I'd never been there before. What do you see? What do people experience? And it's very clear that people's experience of a heritage railway is very different. If you're a visitor, whether it be a child or a grandfather, whether you're one of the volunteers, whether you're a director, whether you're the regulator, whether you're a local authority, everybody's got a different perspective of a heritage railway. So you try and put that part of it together, and you find out, and you try, because at the end of the day, you're trying to find out what are the conditions that you do need to operate and how to keep being sustainable. And then it's immersing yourself in heritage railways. So during the period I was doing the PhD, I was volunteering at a heritage railway operation, which was vintage trains. I was their company secretary. So it was keeping diaries and logs of all the things that I could observe then. Then, as you mentioned, there was the questionnaire element where you formally go out to the movement, to directors, to enthusiasts. You ask them lots of questions. You find out what their profiles are. And then bit by bit, you begin to put all that together. And then there's the other parts of the research is looking through what we have in the UK, which is the register of companies. And so every company has to have returns. So it's looking at the economic performance. Sorry, I mean, it just goes on and on and on. But it just shows the level that everybody who sort of studies heritage railways has to begin to grapple with. And then you get down to the sort of technical things like, boiler certificates. Is the rate of restoration sufficiently sustainable? So you look at the sort of rates of local restoration or carriage restoration. And then you look at the sort of age profile. Particularly, I looked at the directors because their date of births are recorded in Companies House. And you draw up age profiles, diversity profiles. And then you put the whole lot together, you throw it up in the air, and you hope it comes down with some conclusions.
And you've come to a lot of different conclusions thanks to the spread of different elements that you are examining from both the perspective of the leadership as well as the volunteer bases. First, what are some of the things that we as rail preservationists, or at least rail preservationists in the UK, are doing right?
I mean, the positives is the way that, if you like, the engineering part of it, the operation of it, we're very good at that because that's what we all want to do. That's what we all get our pleasure from. And generally, it's not perfect, but, all things taken, we're pretty good at that. We're less good at some of the softer side of how we manage our volunteers, how we exhibit good governance, how we market, because by and large, it's being done mostly, in some cases by paid professional staff, but volunteers. So if you suddenly want a marketing director, you can't put an advert in the paper and in the UK, it will be, I don't know, anything between £40,000 and £70,000 a year. And then you can interview and then you can choose the best candidate. That doesn't happen. You just simply have to look around your volunteers and has anyone done any marketing? Would you like to help? Now, that's not to say that some of the stuff that is produced is not of the highest standard, even better, because the good side is that if a volunteer is doing it, they're doing it because they really want to, and therefore they will be really trying hard to do the best they can. And I think that's what you take. I mean, the average life cycle of a typical company, small medium enterprise in the UK, is around 10 years. I mean, some last much longer, some only make it the first year. Heritage Railways, their average lifespan at the moment is way over 40 years. So they're doing something right. And they're operating slightly differently because they're not driven by profit. They're driven by the value of what they create for the membership and for their visitors. So they're in a slightly different place. And I mean, I think there's a lot to learn from the way Heritage Railways have managed to tackle incredible obstacles from private companies, that are profit driven. And I mean, that really came home in COVID because everything in the UK, as I imagine the US, stops. Now, if you're I don't know, a private restaurant or pub or any private company, you're really on your own. But Heritage Railways were able to call again. It's their social capital value. They're able to call on their supporters to to dig deep into their pockets, simply to give money to keep them going. That's not something that's open to other organisations. I mean, if you take even massive companies, some of the car manufacturers, Apple, something, they have lots of supporters. People will want their branded products. But would they just put their hand in their pocket and just help them, say, oh, you're in a bit of trouble? No, they wouldn't. It's unlikely. Would they work for them for free? Unlikely. So, there's a lot to be, and particularly for other charities as well.
On the one hand, I feel like certainly in the US, there's an acknowledgement on some level of the significance of volunteers. But when we're getting into this idea of social capital, there's so little that's properly understood about it. There's so little that's analyzed, especially with development. One of the pieces that stood out in your results section, you were talking about boards and especially volunteer boards. And do these boards see themselves as being in positions of helping their board members to grow and develop their skills? So it's not just said board member is volunteering solely for the reason that they want to help out, but is that board member getting anything that helps develop them, either from a standpoint of them being able to be a more effective board member, or just skills that they can translate to life in general? And the scores on that were pretty low. What's your sentiments on the recognition and the depth of recognition of social capital in the UK from what you've seen from your conversations and your results?
It's not a concept that is at all properly understood. It's beginning to raise its head, and people are beginning to think about, the importance of mental health, of well-being, and social connections. And this is what keeps people going, keeps people happy in life, and these are incredibly important. But in the past, they've simply been not thought about, not explained, not articulated. And it's interesting you say about being on a board can actually develop you as a person. I mean, one of the things that will engage the next generation, hopefully, is the opportunity that for somebody young, a graduate just leaving university with a marketing degree or an economics degree, could probably quite easily become a board member of a heritage railway. Now, how good is that going to look on your CV and give you the chance to say, well, yes, and heritage railways are exactly the same as real railways in terms of they are operating in a safety critical, regulated environment. This is not a place that you can make mistakes in. You really have to take this seriously. So the opportunity to have experience at a relatively young age in ways that you couldn't in probably similar size companies, and nothing like the complexity of a heritage railway, because even a small heritage railway has got everything from catering to engineering to civil engineering to architecture to finance. It's got a lot, human resources, and to be able to be on a board and have an influence on that's an incredible opportunity, which we've not engaged in. We've not partnered with colleges. We've not partnered with young people in the way that's not to say that some heritage railways have, and some are very good at it. But overall, our scorecard is not brilliant, and we've got to do this quite quickly, because the biggest challenge that heritage railways are currently facing is succession. We've got, the average age of a board member is just over 65. So the reality is, in the next 10 years, we have to find about 700, at least 700 new directors. And it's not just finding those people with the right skills, aptitude, willingness to really spend a lot of time doing this, but they have to be trained. So you just can't walk out and just hopefully find these people. It's going to take a lot. So that's a challenge. And it's not just the board. I mean, all the way down, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a civil engineer, every part of the railway, driver, fireman, signalman, all need training, qualifications, some of which take years and years and years to acquire because they're craft skills. So there's a real challenge out there to transfer that knowledge and that skill. But it's a fabulous opportunity for a lot of youngsters to gain skills and experiences which you can't gain in any other way. If you go out on a very cold morning and try and pick up a coupling which is very heavy, very, very cold, it's not the same as pushing a mouse. And having a Zoom in a coffee or Teams in a coffee, being on the footplate where it's blowing a howling gale, you're getting blown to pieces, the fire is really hot, and at the end of the day, having a chat with your mates and everything else, that's a really different experience. And the same for visitors. Having fine dining with a moving landscape in front of you is totally different to what most restaurants can offer. So we've got all these benefits. We've really got to shout from the rooftops, and we've not been terribly good at that. In the past, heritage rails, I don't know what it's like in the US, but it's difficult to say this, but it's old men playing trains. But it really isn't. Not when you realize all of the skills that are needed. These are very serious, very complex, very complicated businesses.
You mentioned diversity at the top of this, and I feel like that comes into play here. When I look at diversity, there's the element of it's important to be open, period. But expanding on that idea, the more diversity you have, the more diversity of ideas you have. And so much of what we're facing in the 21st century is about needing to think differently and needing to look at different ways of approaching challenges. Another insight from your research that really stood out to me was this idea of entrepreneurship. And I wondered if you could describe a little bit about that in terms of sort of the history of it, how these groups in the UK came into being, and where that entrepreneurial spirit has faded as the curve of the business cycle has taken place.
Yeah, if you start off, a lot of heritage railways were started by, a conversation in a pub. We certainly don't want to lose our local railway. In some cases, an example of Didcot, the steam centre, it was a group of school kids. And nobody told them they couldn't do it. And they had no idea how to do it. And you suddenly start learning, and you're keen to do it. So you don't know, in some cases, the risks you're taking on. Probably if you did, and you did a risk assessment at the beginning, you'd have never started this process. But they carried on. And bit by bit, small battles, they won it, they convinced people, because certainly British Rail at the time, who sold most of the land for the preserved railways, didn't want steam to continue. It was not something that they were keen on. All the regulatory problems and all these things, they overcome them all. So there's an incredible bit of entrepreneurship, taking of quite severe risks in terms of people would raise money on their own houses, all sorts of things that they did. It's important to, when we're talking about risk, risk on the railways very much means safety. And there is no question that safety risk is taken absolutely seriously. That's critical. That's not without it. It's always brilliant, but generally that's not an issue. And everybody buys buys into that. So that's one element of risk. But as you're completely right, it's taking other risks. And I mean, again, it's the amazing things that we rebuilt the Welsh Highland, which is, over 30 miles across, Snowdonia. We have built brand new locomotives, Tornado, and not just built them, but run them at 100 miles an hour on, busy main lines. So, these are risks that people are taking with other new builds, doing impossible projects, dreaming the impossible. I mean, what's kept them going is a very, very clear vision and purpose all the way through that. But you're absolutely right, because we've now reached, in the life cycle of heritage railways, where you have, initial concept, you have, growth, and now they're at the mature stage. And there's only one way that the typical, and this applies to life, any other company, any other organization, you go into standard stages, and the next stage is decline until ultimately you have death. And, that decline can be maybe over 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or it could suddenly tip off the end and it happens very instantly. And there's so many examples of companies that have gone through that life cycle, and industries. But if there is to be a rebirth, then you need a lot of innovation. You need something to refocus it, kick it off again. And that it's got to be more than just, as we're currently doing in the UK, at Christmas, we wrap lots of lights around the train and run it, and for Santa specials, and we've run things like the Polar Express and all these things. And yes, there's no question that they bring in visitors and everything else. But we've got to find new ways of engaging new audiences. And we're really missing a trick, because we're not a diverse hobby and movement, but all that experience and knowledge from people of different backgrounds, people of different genders, we need to include it, and we've not been terribly welcoming. There's lots of horror stories where people of different genders, different backgrounds, have not been made to feel welcome. We have one instance at the moment in the UK where somebody has shone some light on some pretty poor behaviours, and certainly, the whole issue of racism. It's a major issue for a UK sport, cricket, because it suddenly comes to light, certain incidents, the media pick it up, and it's not good news, and we need to tackle those head on. We have to change some of our behaviours, our attitudes. So there's lots of work still to do.
And I appreciate how direct your approach has been in attempting to begin this tackling process, particularly when you were in the research talking about the significant change in leadership in the West Somerset Railway. And I name them because they're named in the thesis. And with the caveat, this is something years ago. With new leadership in place, the WSR is doing quite well. But the fact that you're willing to talk about them in a way that demonstrates that one can talk about where an organization experienced an issue without doing finger pointing and saying, oh, it's inherently quote unquote bad people, but saying there was something systemically wrong here that needed to be addressed, and there was an approach to addressing it, and ultimately that approach worked. In general, I find that we in rail preservation are really, at least in the US, we're really bad at talking about failure. We're really bad about talking about where things go wrong, because if things go wrong, there's so much of a knee-jerk reaction to point fingers and say, it's that person, it's that group, it's that organization, without looking at, well, what are the things that led to that person, that group, that organization? Would you say that that's something that's true in UK preservation, that there has been a reluctance to talk about systemic issues, or do you find that those communication channels are more open?
No, there is definitely a reluctance. People are very, it's human nature. People are uncomfortable with being exposed and having difficult conversations. If you can avoid a difficult conversation, you will. In In terms of safety, um, rail industry overall is pretty good. We have worked very, very hard. We're not as good as the airline industry. They are absolutely second to none. There is an absolute no blame culture. It's increasingly that way. We report near misses. So that side of it is pretty good. When you move to the softer side, we are as uncomfortable as anybody. We don't enjoy these difficult conversations, and it's even harder because we're volunteers, or most people are volunteers. So if somebody's not good at something, do you say, well, yeah, but they're doing it for nothing, they're doing it for free? I mean, I know an instance at the moment where there is a very toxic manager. Now what do you do? Do you deny him his right to enjoy himself? Do you say, you're really causing more problems than you're solving by even because you're putting a lot of hours in and a lot of effort, you're doing a lot of damage at the same time. And these are very difficult conversations. And very often, when you take on extra responsibility, the job changes you, and we don't talk enough about the fact that 99% of people are not bad people, they've only got to their positions because they've been good in other positions. But you see it with politicians, you see it with everybody. The job can change you, and you can become derailed, you can become delusional, and it's understanding, failure and talking about it and where it goes wrong. And it's getting better, but we really starting from a very, very low base. And it's not just Heritage Rails. You go into any, the medical world, the political world, the banking world, lots of, we're uncomfortable. As I said, I think probably one of the best industries is the airline industry, where not only the safety, they take everything very, very seriously.
How do we create a culture where we can open the floor to trying to move in that direction of the airline industry, to try to move in a direction of no blame, but let's talk about systemically what is and is not working?
Very, very difficult. It is only by, you have to nudge it into position. You can't facing it head on is what you ideally will do, but people will just run. It becomes too difficult, and why should you? And particularly, where you're relying on people's goodwill. They're doing this to enjoy their hobby. They're not doing it as a second job. So it's only by more and more conversations where people can feel more and more comfortable by having these conversations, bringing it out, it's got to be brought out into the open, and people got to think, yes, perhaps there is something. So it is. There's no quick solution. It's slow, and hopefully, the next generation, the generation after that, because will be very different in terms of their approach and attitude and transparency and everything else. And it's that changeover process. It's got to be transformational. Sorry, it's a jargon word, but it really, really has to be. And that process has to be managed. How do you suddenly introduce new younger members to a board, different backgrounds, different genders? That's not always easy and comfortable. You need strong, very sensitive people to be in leadership positions.
The Strasbourg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasbourg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasbourg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or railcar project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you to get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. One of the phrases that kept coming up in reading your thesis was, there is no literature on this. There is not a lot of literature on this element. And I'm using generalities because it was a phrase I saw applied to elements dealing with financial valuation of assets. I saw it in terms of assessing social capital and volunteerism. To me, it felt sort of frightening that here's this industry that's existed, preservation industry that in the UK has existed for 6 decades plus, and yet there seems frighteningly little understood about how it works.
Oh, yes. And I mean, the trouble is, where I come from a place without data, you're flying blind. And there is very little data out there because it's not in the past been seen as an academic subject to study. And there isn't the money within the industry to commission expensive consultants to go out and gather data and do research and all the things. So in truth, you're flying by the seat of your pants for most of the time. And one of the things that I want to try and set off, and as part of the thesis, is to try to encourage more people to do research, to find out, to ask some questions. And one of the things I'm now involved in is sort of creating a heritage rail knowledge network, because we have to have a place to store all this knowledge, and we have to share it. Heritage railways often see themselves in competition with other heritage railways. In truth, they're not. They're in competition with all the other attractions and facilities around about them, and whether people will even go outside their house or just watch, Netflix at home. So the competition is not between themselves, and therefore they have to cooperate far more. They have to collaborate far more. They have to share more information. And if several of them club together and got a report or sponsor some research, then that's better than doing nothing. So again, it's making people aware that you really need this. It's nothing like a challenge to actually wake people up. In the past, it was all about engineering challenges. How do you build a brand new steam locomotive? And this is what gives me confidence, is because the ingenuity and the dedication and the passion and all those things have been shown 100 times over. So we've demonstrated that. We now have to apply it in a different direction.
I'm interested in this idea of a heritage knowledge network. What is the shape that that's taking at this point?
The shape it's taking is that myself and a group of other sort of interested academics have managed to get a very small grant, and that will be used to do research into how to set up a knowledge network. And it's seen that if we could do it, then it could benefit other parts of whether it's heritage aircraft or canals or lots of other heritage, because all of them have to transfer their knowledge to the next generation, otherwise it dies. So actually establishing it and what it looks like, and if we could make it worldwide and global, great. And because what people don't realize is how rich a seam heritage railways are for researchers. You have defined populations, you have tremendous complexity, and also they would be willing to help because it's in their own interest. And certainly in the UK, I'm not sure about the US, you can do things on heritage railways which you can't do on the national network because of safety. I mean, in terms of the line side management, the environmental line side management of heritage railways, which is a big issue, you can't do experiments on, a railway that's running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, but you can do it on a heritage railway which doesn't run at night, or has winter periods of shutdown, or you can get access to the track safely. So there's all sorts of areas that you can research, which all are needed at the moment.
Research can sometimes seem like this big daunting idea, but I think the reality, when I look at the U.S. rail preservation scene, and especially some of the star players within that, they're unofficially doing research by way of trying new ideas. They're recognizing that events are such a key foundational stone of how you make your business sustainable, because it is a business. Even if you're a nonprofit, there is still a business to it. They are trying different ways of partnering with other organizations. So research, while a formal term, really has plenty of ways that can be played with even outside of an academic sense.
Absolutely. I mean, everything we do, we are learning. Every day I learn something new, and it's how you apply that, and really how you measure it. You need something more than, well, I think that idea works. That we've introduced in the UK things like the Polar Express. It's been a phenomenon, I think, over the last 4, 5, 6 years. But there's no real shared figures of how much difference that has really made to individual railways, because they guard those, they think of them as very commercially sensitive. But it's actually important to see what benefits arise from it. And I know, because I was involved in running one set of a series of Polar Expresses, the really big wake up and realization is it was a totally different market to the one that we used to have. It was families and children who had never been on a steam train at all, would never have gone near a steam train, but it was the association with the Polar Express, with Hollywood. That was what drew them. Now, if only, just a handful of those visitors actually sort of took an interest and say, oh, gosh, that sounds, I'd like to know more about that. And we captured them at that moment. But some figures and actually research on how we could do that, share it. There's a whole series of things that we can do so much better. And it's not always that difficult to do. Just asking people, feedback forms, volunteers are, willing to do that. But very often they don't have the form to ask people. When we run excursions on the main line, I mean, we have a captive audience for the best part of 8-10 hours. We could talk to them and find an awful lot out about what interests them or not. We rarely ever do.
It's good to be thinking about these opportunities that we have to learn either by experiential what we do, or just by capturing a snapshot of what a person's thinking at a particular moment and trying to ride a wave of momentum that comes when, hey, Christmas, holidays, there's that train association, even outside of Polar Express, which has been a particular brand, but Christmas trains under the tree is such a long-lasting thing, certainly in American culture. And so just that time to say, hey, train is in some element of the pop culture's attention. Maybe there's a bad Hollywood movie out there that has a train featured. Maybe we think it's bad as rail fans, but it's in the public's eye. Rope it in.
I mean, what's been the most important things? I mean, Thomas the Tank Engine. I mean, you even have, Thomas the Tank Engine in the US. And Harry Potter, with the train going over the Glenfinnan Viaduct. We have just sold a heritage locomotive to Japan to go into a theme park. we can't ignore these opportunities. And yes, if it appears in film or anything like that, then we tried quite hard to actually get a Hollywood film company to be very interested in trying to do a film about in Victorian times of what's called the bloomer, which is a particular class of locomotive of the 1840s. And we even constructed a story that they could do, and with CGI now it would be fantastic. And of course, if you could ever get that off the ground, everybody then wants to see the real thing. Everyone wants to touch it, travel behind it. So there's lots of avenues to go down, but we're not terribly well organized as a sector. We do have a trade body. I'm sure there's something similar in the States. But we really have to put a lot more momentum behind pooling resources, and not let just individual heritage railways try to reinvent the wheel each time. We've got to be smarter at this.
A lot of what we've discussed today, Robin, is on an organizational level, which is hopefully beneficial to those who are on boards and at higher levels of their organization to kind of bounce ideas off of. I want to look a little bit more at the individual level. As an individual, it can be a little daunting. How should an individual take what you've begun exploring here with your thesis? What is an individual level takeaway message?
Well, we all have a degree of responsibility. If we, the things that we enjoy, and prior to me embarking on this, my interaction with heritage railways and railways generally was behind the lens of a camera. That's what I did. That's the emotion I felt when I went and saw steam locomotives climbing steep banks, on frosty mornings or on beautiful sunsets. That's the level of engagement for me. All emotion. Nothing, that was it, emotion. But and everyone's, and I would, throw in a few pound into donation boxes or buy lots of secondhand books on stalls. So I know that I'm sort of contributing and helping and doing my part, but probably that was it. But the truth is that if we want that to continue and we want our children to be able to enjoy and share the same experiences, then we all actually have a responsibility to keep it going. And that responsibility can, it's sufficient that if I can encourage my son or, a niece or a nephew or a grandchild or somebody else, if each of us could just pass on that enthusiasm and what it means to the next generation, we've cracked the problem. I mean, there are always going to be people who want to be leaders, want to be engineers, want to be drivers. In the population, there's one of everybody, as long as but it's actually making sure that they can engage with that they can realize. So, I mean, the young kid, if I just go back to my own childhood, I stood at the end of platforms, I was allowed into the cab of a locomotive or into a signal box, and it became alive. I had an injection into my arm and an addiction, the steam went in, and it stayed with me for life. Now it's much more difficult to do that. One, because there's far more competition of other interests. Go back to the 60s in Great Britain, 50s and 60s, and most kids were train spotters. They had a love for trains and everything else, and it was everywhere. Now that's not the case. You can go through life and probably never see a steam locomotive. Less difficult in the UK than perhaps in the US, but it's just something on films or so. It's making sure that when people do visit them, that you really engage with them. That you have to give them experiences and to show them, this could actually be a lifelong interest. I mean, for me, the benefits I've received from that, that the pleasure I've had how I saw the world. Geography was a railway map. History was the history of railways. Physics was how steam and heat work. So it can open the path for so much. But we've got to make people aware of that. So if a school wants a demonstration of physics, take them to the local heritage railway. And it's real because it's a very big boiler. And this is mechanical energy. And you really don't want to touch this because it's very hot. I remember we took some groups of school children when Flying Scotsman visited the heritage railway I'm involved in. And to see the expression on kids that we, took them into the coach, and then we took them through, as you know, for Flying Scotsman, it's got a corridor tender, so you can actually walk through the tender and then out into the footplate, where there's a fire and everything else. And every one of those children that came to that door, their eyes went boom. That suddenly this wasn't a classroom. This was totally different. This was a wonderful experience. They won't forget that. But we have to, it won't, as I keep saying, it won't happen by accident. We really got to organise and arrange that. Now, I mean, in the UK, we're very fortunate. Probably you can't, within 50 miles of anywhere in the UK, you'll find a heritage railway, in most cases, less. That's a bit more challenging, I would guess, in the States. I mean, there are probably states who don't have a heritage railway at all.
Close to it. I think Hawaii is kind of fluctuated on that front. But yes, it's certainly, I know growing up in northwestern Pennsylvania, I found myself in kind of an oasis of opportunities to connect with an operation and get, certainly in terms of volunteering, and see what the door is. As you said, so much of it is just, where's the door? I want to get in. Where's the door? Let alone what are the benefits of walking through the door? I want to see the door in the first place. The corridor tender that leads to the firebox. I think that's such a good metaphor for just how we should think about presenting ourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, you build it up, through the secret passage and everything else. I mean, children just love this. And, it's like no other experience that, you can't get that experience on the internet, even with with virtual reality, everything else, because, I mean, it touches all of the senses. It is touch, it is sight, it is sound, it is smell, and it's even taste as well. So every part of every sense is coming alive, which is involved, and that's fairly rare. And we've got this unbelievable, it's a global legacy. The age of steam had more impact, and it may lead to sort of where we are at the moment with climate and everything else, but without the age of steam, it would be a very, very different world at the moment. Now, that there's lots of positives and negatives. You can argue and debate that for hours, but let's have the debate. But there is absolutely no doubt that it's made an incredible impact. In every single country. I mean, it opened up the West in the US. It wouldn't have happened in any other way.
And I think what we will discover as this century continues to unfold is that certainly, while a lot of what we base our ideals on are sort of replicating the past and talking to history, the reality is, as these engines become more at home on their heritage railways than they were for their original owners, which is already something that's happening with a number of steam locomotives around the world, it's looking at that and realizing, wait a second, we're building a history today. What is the modern norm for us today? That will still be history eventually. And the significance of that is that it changes the narrative as we go, because the narrative keeps evolving. And the more we're open to that, the more we grow.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have to engage a new generation. And I mean, we have in the UK, we have high-speed trains. We have what's called pacers, which are little units that used to shuttle around, diesel units. And nothing that particularly interests me, but there is a whole generation that are interested in diesels and everything. So nostalgia moves on at a rate of, we can argue whether it's 30 or 40 years, or 50 years, doesn't matter. But there is no doubt that nostalgia is not fixed, and it will be different for each generation, and that's the real challenge. How it moves forward, and in both directions as well, because there's no doubt that heritage railways of 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s were recreating a golden period of effectively the 1950s. Why was that? Because most of the assets saved were from that period, and it's what everybody could remember. But the moment you disconnect that and you have a new generation, there's the whole railway history of Victorian, the growth of railways, which is absolutely fascinating. The politics, the economics of that, we haven't really discovered that. Hollywood hasn't discovered it. It's absolute treasure trove of. So that's another direction that we can simply rediscover, because it not once you move outside people's real memories of what they can remember as a child, then you can go into far greater detail, the early railways, entrepreneurs, and really there is so much to teach, not replicate it, but simply the lessons learned. What are the lessons, and how the early industrial revolution, the age of steam, got going? What happened? Because it certainly had as much or more impact than internet or anything like that. Those are debates that you don't often hear. You do occasionally, but not as much as perhaps we could. And this is where the giving Hollywood or Netflix sort of there's all these incredible stories out there. You make a series of this, and people are going to be glued to it, because the fascination, the bitter rivalry between personalities, the intrigue, the criminality, it's all there.
This adventure you've been on, the thesis you've put together, what are ways that you want to further getting this knowledge out there so that people can explore your research in detail and build upon it?
That's what we're doing at this moment. It's raising awareness. I'm happy that any of your listeners want to read the thesis. They can. That's no problem. I'm happy to send it to them, spread the word as best we can, write articles, talk to people. That's all. We have to raise awareness, because there is a wake-up call. We could, if we get this wrong, sleepwalk into oblivion. It's very easy to do. And I'm very, very keen that there is a positive side to this, as we've discussed. This is not a cry for wolf, that if you don't do something instantly, but it's really coming up quite quickly, and COVID has not helped that situation one bit, and it just shows, because nothing stopped heritage railways. They all operated for, best part of 40, 50 years, and then suddenly, one day in March 2020, they all stopped. And I was at a conference just a month before that, and it wasn't mentioned.
It's amazing how quickly the world can change, and it shows how the more that any institution can be adaptable to the world, whether it's a gradual change such as the emergence of the digital age, or a rapid change such as a pandemic, the more we make ourselves adaptable without compromising our values. It's a balance, absolutely, but the more that we can adapt, the longer we survive and thrive.
Yeah, and the pandemic, I was concerned, but a number of heritage railways in 2021 had some of the best summers and some of the best figures, partly because of what we call in the UK staycation, where people were staying at home and it was just too difficult to travel the world. But nonetheless, we haven't yet lost a railway because of the pandemic. There are two railways that have failed, which is, but for different reasons. And one has failed but has survived. So, and that's in a group of 200 plus. So we're doing pretty well. But you've got to keep doing it. And yes, there are, we cannot ignore the challenges. That's the critical thing. And as long as we're alive to those challenges, I'm positive that we'll get there. But let's work at it.
I like that sentiment. Let's work at it indeed. Dr. Coombes, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast to talk about your research. And certainly if you guys are interested in reading it, as he has made the generous offer, you should absolutely. It is academic, interpret that as you will, but it is a treasure trove of information. And he did a phenomenal job in putting it together. And I certainly learned a lot from it. Though it's the UK, I think there's definitely lessons in there for us US rail preservationists as well. Thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for having me.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Stephen Pivovarsky of the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway, one of the famous Maine 2-foot gauge railroads, which led to the question, what's your favorite narrow gauge railroad? Which led to a lot of responses. First, from the roundhousepodcast.com, Aaron writes, the Austin and Northwestern Railroad, one of two short lines here in central Texas, was originally built as a 3-foot gauge line. Though it has been standard gauged and gone through several name and ownership changes, it still makes a living hauling limestone and other quarry products, just as it did when it was first built. Really interesting one that I wouldn't have heard of, and honestly, how many thousands of narrow gauge railroads have existed that most of us have not heard of? From YouTube, Jacob Durbin writes, my favorite narrow gauge has to be the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington, without a doubt. They're such a class act, and the 2-foot is so charming and approachable for everyone. There was a lot of love on Facebook for the WWF. There was probably even more love for the good old East Broad Top. A lot of folks chiming in their favorite as being the EBT. Here's some that I hadn't heard of that I wanted to highlight. James Bradus writes, the original 45.5-inch gauge Arcata and Mad River. David Hahn highlights the Chicago Tunnel Company, 2-foot gauge, 60 miles, 150 locomotives, 3,100 cars. And Seth Burgess writes, Lancaster, Oxford, and Southern for the win. All of these guys, by the way, had photos of theirs, so bonus points to them for that. Your question of the day for this episode is, what makes you the most optimistic or the most concerned about the future of rail preservation? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com, links to social media there. Don't forget you have till the end of February 2022 to take advantage of our launch sale of our photo store, streamlinermedia.com/store. And the coupon code you use to get 5% off your order is OurHouse. Because, of course, the Roundhouse is our house.